This is Current Thought, Con Edison's podcast providing a first look at the cutting-edge ideas, innovations, and technology that is capturing the attention of the energy industry. Today's guest will have you thinking about energy in a whole new way. It might just change your life.
Welcome to Current Thought. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Corbliss. Catching the power of the ocean winds and converting that energy to electricity makes offshore wind an exciting alternative to burning fossil fuels. Some of the best and brightest minds in the energy industry are working to make offshore wind a reality. Con Edison Transmission, a leader in the energy industry, is offering smart solutions to some of the greatest challenges facing the industry today. In this, the first of a three-part series on offshore wind, we're talking about planning for offshore wind with Mallorie Azzolini. Mallorie is a senior planning analyst and is here to discuss some of the industry's pain points and Con Edison's solutions for them.
Hi, Mallorie. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
So, Mallorie, you work for Con Edison Transmission. Can you tell us what Con Edison Transmission, or CET, does and why?
Absolutely. So, Con Edison Transmission is a subsidiary of Con Edison Incorporated. And unlike the other two Con Edison subsidiaries, Orange and Rockland Utilities and Con Edison Company of New York, we are not a utility. Instead, we have a focus on developing electric transmission projects throughout the country, oftentimes through competitive solicitations, and really grow the company's clean energy portfolio at an enterprise level. And so for us as transmission developers, this is a really exciting time. The electric grid throughout the country is changing drastically with the build out of renewable energy, and there's a tremendous opportunity for transmission expansion because of this. We as Con Edison Transmission have been active in several solicitations for transmission to support offshore wind, and we also have a portfolio of on-land renewables-based projects. So, for example, we are the largest owner of a company called New York Transco, which is a New York-based electric transmission operator and developer. And just this past summer, New York Transco energized the New York Energy Solution Project, which upgraded transmission facilities to relieve congestion on New York State's bulk power system and enabled the delivery of reliable, clean energy resources from upstate New York to downstate demand centers. We've also been active in New England for a number of years to develop transmission solutions that enhance New England's grid for future energy needs. We've seen the dynamic of transmission development change to accommodate onshore renewables. We are also seeing a similar, more complex dynamic when delivering energy from offshore wind projects.
The offshore wind industry continues to grab headlines in the news, and most recently, the coverage has been focused on the increasing cost of building offshore wind. Can you give us an overview of what's happening as well as the challenges that specific type of energy poses?
Yes, that's a really great question. So right now, the nation is in the midst of a dramatic transition toward clean energy. As we see the threat of climate change become more evident, the need for action becomes more urgent. And states in the Northeast are making great strides to expand and upgrade their electric grids to accommodate offshore wind. And they've awarded not only offshore wind generation projects, but also transmission projects in a very short span of time. And so when we look at this, the magnitude of new infrastructure is going to require a large upfront investment. And to mitigate this, legislators have created some avenues to lessen the burden to customers. For example, you have federal funding opportunities for clean energy projects, and then states have also worked in parameters to fix prices of projects where available in the solicitations themselves. However, the challenge that we're seeing most recently is really twofold. So one, with an increase in development of offshore wind, there's an added demand for equipment, labor, and materials. And this demand is not only driving up costs for all of these components, but it's also impacting supply chain. So if we were to look at this, from a high level perspective, if a delay in one project is caused by supply chain, it has the potential to start a domino effect and then impact subsequent projects, which need the same products and materials, labor, and equipment. And we really want to avoid this. The second challenge that we're facing right now is something that all of us have experienced firsthand over the last year or so, and that's prices rising due to inflation. And the offshore wind industry isn't immune to these impacts. So right now, states are actively working to determine the best path forward that limits cost impacts from inflation to customers and these projects that we're trying to build, but while also, avoiding delaying the building of these projects and building out the infrastructure we need right now to support the clean energy transition.
Does bringing offshore wind energy onshore pose special challenges? And how does Con Edison Transmission solve for those challenges?
From a high-level perspective, we have an unprecedented amount of offshore wind power that will be entering our electric grid over the next few years. And this is going to require changes to the system that we know today. One way to mitigate this is careful planning and a great deal of collaboration between developers, utilities, and legislators. So for the on-land portion specifically, this is going to require redesigning and upgrading the grid to accommodate not only a different type of energy, but also a different direction of power flow that we've traditionally seen. If you're just looking at the on-land portion, the first challenge you face is making landfall. What that means is, eventually you have to move the offshore wind power from many miles offshore to bring cables and interconnect into the on-land system. So crossing from ocean to landfall is usually in a densely populated area like beach communities. And we want to limit disruption and impact to communities and the environment as much as possible. One area that poses a challenge is that original approvals for new offshore wind projects were selected to use long radial lines built by offshore wind generators to a point of interconnection on the existing grid. And what this means is it's kind of a first come, first serve approach. So generators are constructing the transmission directly from their offshore wind farm to interconnect and make landfall into the onshore power grid. This is not a sustainable approach, mainly because if every wind farm had one radial line, it would be extremely disruptive to the environment and local communities because you'd need to make landfall separately and route separate routes for each of those lines. And there'd also be a lot of redundancy and cost. A way that Con Edison Transmission develops our projects is through the use of what's called a power corridor. This approach uses key routes, kind of looking at it like a highway system, where multiple delivery cables can be co-located into one single corridor. And this corridor can be designed for future growth. So this way, you're only making landfall once, digging up and burying these cables at one point in time. And you can develop it so that it has extra room. So if other offshore wind farms come online in the future, you can pull cables through that underground corridor without opening the streets back up and disturbing the environment and local communities. Once the power corridor is designed, it also needs to then take that offshore wind energy and inject it into points on the existing grid that can accommodate and distribute that electricity to customers. And finding a place where you can interconnect into the system circles back to the collaboration and planning component. And so it requires a lot of work with state agencies and then also local utilities so we can identify the right places to connect into the system to make sure that this energy gets delivered to customers.
Can you tell us more about what Con Edison Transmission solution is to containing costs for offshore wind?
Sure. From our experience over the last 2 years and through Con Edison, limiting costs for offshore wind can be achieved in a few different ways. First, it's imperative that offshore transmission is owned and operated independently from generation. This is a principle that has been used in several states today and historically for on-land electric generation. And its value is as important as ever with offshore wind. If you have independence, it will allow the transmission to cost-effectively serve customers and expand when needed and allow for transmission to be connected to an offshore mesh network that improves reliability. Independent ownership allows each entity, transmission developer, and generation developer to focus on operating those facilities in which they have specific expertise and are most familiar with. Further, when designing transmission by a transmission developer, it can foster expandability, which could allow for flexibility in the future for offshore wind development, allowing us to build what we need now, but also build for the future when we know much more renewable generation is coming with electrification. Another component you have for cost mitigation is planning for cost recovery. If the build out of transmission to support offshore wind is not planned properly, the cost to customers could be far higher. Transmission is considered a long-lived asset, which is helpful for mitigating costs. One way to describe this would be that if your transmission asset will be in service for 100 years, you can spread those costs out over time instead of having one lump sum payment upfront that would burden customers. Planning for cost recovery is something that needs to be clearly defined upfront in order to make the most of its benefits. And last, something specifically that we work into all of our project designs at Con Edison Transmission is that we like to use an approach called cost containment. So cost containment is a framework that puts controls in place for components of a project that may be subject to cost overruns and helps protect customers. So, for example, traditionally, if there are cost overruns in a project, customers would be required to pay for those cost overruns. What cost containment does is rather than having customers pay for 100% of cost overruns, this framework identifies a certain percentage of those costs that would be paid for by the developer. Recently, the requirement to use cost containment framework has been seen in many different competitive transmission solicitations, both for onshore renewables-based projects, but also for offshore wind transmission.
So, Mallorie, what's next for CET?
We have a lot of opportunity to look forward to in the next few years, both onshore and offshore. This past June, Propel New York Energy, which is an electric transmission project developed by New York Transco and the New York Power Authority, was selected by New York to bolster parts of New York's electric transmission network in Long Island, New York, and Westchester County. Propel New York Energy is a 90-mile project and an over $3 billion investment, which will improve system reliability and resiliency and create enhanced transmission capabilities that are needed from increasing demand and will ultimately serve customers clean energy. In addition, we're also encouraged by the steps states in the Northeast are taking to build out independently owned offshore wind transmission and look forward to participating in upcoming competitive solicitations in New York, New Jersey, and New England. Of note, New York recently announced that they will hold a competitive solicitation in 2024 for additional transmission facilities that will deliver offshore wind generation to New York City. And this, too, is a major step toward achieving the clean energy vision that we look forward to participating in. And at Con Edison Transmission, as we develop solutions to meet the needs of these solicitations, we strive to continue our mission to develop transmission that brings renewable energy to customers in a cost-effective manner that is future growth enabling, reliable, and resilient.
Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our guest, Mallorie Azzolini from Con Edison Transmission. Make sure to look for our next podcast in the series that will take a deeper dive into offshore wind transmission corridors, how they work, and how they will benefit the environment and customers. This is Current Thought. I'm Anne-Marie Corbliss.
If you have a technology, an idea, a comment, or a question, send us an email to podcast@coned.com. We'd love to hear from you. Remember to follow us on all our social platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Our handle is @ConEdison. Make sure to use our hashtag #CurrentThought.